You want to add?
Well, I see diversity and inclusion suffering at the end of the crisis if certain things are not preserved and enhanced. And it's not lost on me that I'm on this panel as a president of Morgan State University, and I'm also a president of one of the largest HBCUs in the country. And as such, I do think that it will be an incredibly missed opportunity if there is not tremendous investments in the HBCUs that are overproducing talent, diverse talent in certain fields. And if that does not happen, and many of the institutions struggle through this period, and if they struggle too much where their productivity is impaired, then I think that's going to have a deleterious effect on diversity and inclusion with regard to the talent that would be available for the nation. So I think we have to be careful in this space here when you have 14 of the nearly 300 or 400 accredited ABET engineering schools that are at HBCUs, but they are producing 30% of all Black engineers. That at the end of this, that is really intact and it is even more substantial. So I kind of look at the diversity and inclusion piece in this space a little bit differently than at the kind of a campus level where you are trying to make sure that all of the populations, both the underrepresented ones primarily, have a voice in the fabric and the culture of the institution. I understand that I came out of, of course, University of Wisconsin system, Auburn and Rutgers, where that focus was there. But in this space, I would come at it a bit more broadly across a genre of institutions and how critically important it is for HBCUs and minority serving institutions to be really enhanced during this period.
We have a lot of questions coming in, so I want to get to one of those if I can. And the question is, how can fundraisers and development teams help you to address diversity and inclusion concerns at your institution and across higher education as a whole? Anyone want to take that one?
I think, first, I think a recognition that many of our students don't have the financial means to persist in college. And I think philanthropic support can certainly help those students persist and get across the finish line. And so I can speak once again here at Morgan, where every single year, I basically reinvest about 22% of institutional aid back into students. Because if we didn't do that, we would see, who knows, half of our students actually drop out. And so in this space, it's going to be even more challenging because many of our students will have their parents who have lost jobs. It's going to be very, very financially challenging for them. And so what I would say to the philanthropic community is make investments in the students that can least afford to remain in college and cross the finish line if we want to see ultimately a more diverse, inclusive, and competitive society.
Yeah. Here's another question. A question inspired by Dr. Bumpus, but open to anyone. How are your institutions using their platforms to raise awareness about the inequities that have been rendered more obvious by COVID-19?
Great question. Our leaders are doing a phenomenal job in that respect. They're writing op-ed pieces, they're appearing on television shows, they're doing webinars and podcasts, but most importantly, they're speaking to what I consider to be the value proposition of enrolling in a community college. When I speak about the fact that a lot of our colleges are showing an increase this summer, I think it's largely due to the fact that they're hearing from leaders of these colleges about what they're doing this fall to make jobs attainable, to provide pathways towards jobs. And that's what's key and critical for most folks, whether they're parents or whether they're students making those choices. This online environment is relatively new for most of us to do it full time, and for all students. We've all had a portion of our students enrolled online. But when it comes to enrolling in a course and having to pay X number of dollars for that course, it better lead to something. There should be some results that accrue from that investment. And I think the value proposition of what enrolling in your institution is going to become very huge for many of our higher education institutions in the future.
Yeah. Dr. Sands?
Well, I think let me address maybe the philanthropy question. One of the things that we had made as a priority in our strategic plan and in our new campaign that we just happened to launch a few months ago was access and equity, and providing for the, I think, pretty grand aspirations we had to broaden the students we serve. And that was going really well. We're now taking a pause, though, because of COVID-19 and having to direct that philanthropy to places where people are very passionate about serving when they have the resources available. And that has basically been our Student Emergency Fund, which has seen an influx of resources recognizing the plight that our students are in. Coming out of this, again, I think I just emphasized that I think philanthropy will be a big part in this. I think the COVID-19 crisis, as everyone's been saying, has really illuminated the divides that have always been there, and we talk about them, we try to work on them, but it has raised the stakes considerably. And I actually am confident our philanthropy and our donors will embrace that as a priority going forward. So I feel pretty confident that's where we're going to come out of, or how we're going to come out of this in a year or two.
I'm sorry, go ahead, Dr. Bumpus.
I was going to add something about the philanthropy question. Today, unlike it was maybe 5 or 10 years ago, these philanthropic organizations are coming together as a group to fund various initiatives. It used to be you went to Lumina or Gates and they would fund something, but now they're coming to you as partners. And the extent to which you can make a specific ask to make a specific difference, and you've really got to show what the investment will yield. And we're finding we're much more successful when we are when we're able to draw a direct line between their investment and the outcomes that we are projecting that will come from that investment. And I'm finding that we're getting many more philanthropic organizations interested in what we're doing. The whole fundraising work is hard. It's very hard and very difficult, but you've got to be able to articulate what it is you're trying to do with that investment. And it's truly an investment in both the leader and the organization and what you're trying to do.
There are a number of questions here about faculty hiring and concerns about whether or not searches that may have been in motion, whether or not those will be killed or suspended as a result of COVID-19. Dr. Sands, where are you all at in terms of searches, particularly as it relates to faculty, and ensuring that there's diversity, of course, in those searches as well?
Yes, we do have a hiring freeze in place, but that freeze has a process by which the leadership can appeal to the chief business officer or the provost for permission to go ahead and hire. And their decisions are being made on the basis of our strategic plan. So I actually think that our faculty will become more diverse as a result of this, not because of it really directly, but indirectly, because a lot of the hiring we're doing is focused on achieving the goals of the strategic plan, which tie directly into diversity, equity, and inclusion. So time will tell, but we are doing that experiment right now, and we are approving some searches going forward that address those strategic priorities.
Dr. Wilson, do you still have searches underway there, Morgan?
We too are under our hiring freeze, but those searches that actually commenced prior to the freeze, we are supporting the continuation of those searches, but we are not instituting new faculty or staff searches at this point.
Yeah. Yeah. A question about new pathways, career pathways initiatives, and how do you deal with individuals who are thinking about transitioning to, meaning students, to new careers? And Dr. Bumpus, you had alluded to this a little bit earlier on. Could this be an opportunity for colleges to again attract those students and bring them in who now have to respond to this crisis?
Jamal, you're spot on with that observation, my friend, because that's exactly where I see this going as an opportunity for our colleges. We had a guided pathways initiative that we launched about 4 years ago in conjunction with Achieving the Dream, the Aspen Institute, the Community College Research Center, and Public Agenda, SESI, and a few others. But it was all around redesigning and reframing both the entry point as well as a pathway to specific jobs. And one of the things we wanted to make sure we included was the opportunity of doing more stackable credentials and opportunities for there to be exit points for when students started their matriculation at a college, that they had a number of points at which they could move out and get jobs. I had a board member when I was leading the Louisiana system who used to say to me all the time, Walter, I really like all these sexy programs you're coming forward with, but what I'm interested in is not the AB or the BA, but it's the JOB. To the extent we can get our students jobs is the most important thing you can do for this system and this district. And while that was almost 20 years ago, it's still the same. Folks come to us for a variety of reasons, certainly to be educated, well educated. But secondly, it's also be sure that they can attain a job at the end of that matriculation. And so guided pathways, they've contributed greatly to what I think I see happening in community colleges now. They're redesigning the intake process, everything from admissions to registration to coaching to mentoring, the whole bit. And I think in many ways it's starting to redefine what we consider to be our support services for students, but probably more importantly, our support for faculty in the classroom. So the extent to which we can give our faculty members more information about the students that are coming into their classrooms each semester, allowing those faculty members to have the support they need to transition into some workforce courses, if possible, I think we're better served.
Yeah. A couple of questions, one for Dr. Sands and Wilson. There are a number of colleges and universities who announced that they would stop the tenure clock for junior faculty given the COVID-19 crisis. Is that something that's happening at your institutions or at least is under discussion?
Yeah, I can give you Virginia Tech's perspective on that. Yes, we haven't introduced a new policy, but our existing policy allows a request for an extension of the tenure clock. And we have shared with our faculty through communications of all sorts that we expect them to take advantage of that. If they need to, it will be an easy process, and we expect to have quite a few requests. So fortunately, our existing policy accommodates it.
And yes, from the standpoint of Morgan, the answer is yes. As a matter of fact, I just concluded my Board of Regents meeting on Tuesday, and this was one of the action items that I had on the agenda. The board unanimously passed it. And so this not only will impact junior faculty, but for all tenure track faculty at Morgan who are up for tenure and or promotion. We are basically suspending it for 1 year. If they would like to still come up, they would have the option of doing that. But really, we decided to, given all of the disruptions that are taking place, to stop the clock and basically give them an opportunity to deal with the issues that they're dealing with now in terms of the transition to online and ministering to the other needs of students. And we can pick up at the end of this year of where we left off.
Dr. Wilson, Dr. Michael Lomax from the United Negro College Fund recently suggested that perhaps the Pell Grant should be doubled as a way of helping to address the needs of the low-income students I was just curious to know what your thoughts were on that, and anyone else as well.
Well, I am I'm a proponent of free college for those in our society who really cannot afford it. I would hate to see our society drift to a point where college is really only for the individuals who can afford it. And so if that means doubling the Pell Grant on the part of students who have very, very limited resources, and some who can expect to receive zero family contribution to their education, I strongly support that. But you know, based on my experience here, we have to figure out a better way of providing financial support to students who are coming from limited resource families. Otherwise, I think we are going to end up with college educated people in the country coming from the top 5 or 10% of the population, and that's not where we need to be. So yes, I support what Dr. Lomax has put forth because I think it will enable more students from those kinds of backgrounds that I indicated, limited resource families, to be able to stay in college and to get their degrees.
Anyone else want to?
I'd like to chime in on that one, and I totally agree with my friend Dr. Wilson, but I think it can be both and. A free college and maybe an increase in the Pell. I'm not so sure it needs to be double, but I think certainly an increase is appropriate at this time. Even though there are free college programs and there are a million of them around the country, oftentimes that's just tuition. It doesn't include room or the housing for the student. It doesn't include meals for the students. It doesn't include books. And in some cases, it doesn't include fees. And so to the extent that a student has to use their Pell Grants, because as you know, many of these free programs are last dollar programs, which means you have to put in your Pell Grant first, and then the institution picks it up at the end. So I think students still have a lot of unmet need, as it's referred to within the financial aid community. And so the extent to which we could increase the Pell Grant programs would be appreciated.
Question for Dr. Sands. A strategic plan can only be as good as its implementation. So how do you budget for the implementation of activities when almost all institutions are experiencing financial challenges?
Well, it's a great question. I would turn it around a little bit, though. When you have a strategic plan that have good buy-in for, you're basically guiding those choices, because it's going to come down to choices. If you have $1,000 to spend, where are you going to spend it? If the strategic plan says this is your priority, that's where it's going to go. So there will be some difficult choices down the road, and that's where a strategic plan is its most valuable.
Yeah. We only have a few more minutes, and I'm just curious if each one of you could just give an assessment of where do we go from here. Obviously, there are going to be some tough decisions that has to be made in terms of budgets and so forth, but how can we keep laser focus on diversity, equity, and inclusion, even as we're grappling with these fiscally challenging times? Dr. Buffus?
I would continue to talk about the fact that it needs to be embedded in a college's strategic plan, written that way. The college leader supports it. And what, as I said before, what's included in a plan is often measured and evaluated. And then if you tie that to the key performance indicators of your leaders, I'm at least relatively sure it will be addressed to some level. But I think we've got to continue to keep our eye on what's going on with student success and diversity. Because if you've got diversity only and you don't couple that with student success and high expectations for all of your students, it's all for naught anyway. So I'm convinced that most of our colleges and universities have seen the light in regards to this priority and are making progress.
Thank you. Dr. Sands?
Well, I agree with Dr. Bumpus. I think the element of the buy-in that I think we're going to have to reinforce is at the board level. So I can speak for Virginia Tech, and I think a lot of similar institutions, that you do get good buy-in from the board when you introduce a strategic plan. Usually they weigh in on it, they may have to approve it. But this is a time when I think we have to go back to our boards and really talk about our commitment to the strategic plan, especially if it's been integrated with diversity, inclusion, and equity at the forefront. And those are going to be really interesting and difficult conversations in some cases. I'm fortunate that I have a board that is very supportive, and I think we'll be fine. But I'm going to have to put some more effort into that than I did in the past, because when I think the board starts to see the tough choices that we're making, there's going to be a deeper dive into, okay, what are we really trying to do here? So I'm looking forward to those conversations, but they're coming.
Yeah. And Dr. Wilson.
Yeah, I think the failure to keep diversity and inclusion at the forefront of our planning would be a miscarriage of leadership. And I agree with Dr. Bumpus and Dr. Sands that it has to be baked into our planning. I would just offer as well, we got to really keep our focus on the future. And the future is one that is embedded in a more diverse nation. There's no going back from that. And the populations that are growing are the ones that are in need of a high quality credential beyond high school. Otherwise, we're going to end up in 20, 25 years in the country where you're going to have a large swath of the population that is non-white, but we have not paid enough attention to their getting this high quality credential beyond high school, but that they may not be equipped with the kind of skills to enable this country to be as competitive as it needs to be. So I agree with Dr. Bumpus and Dr. Sands that our governing boards must understand this. I think our leadership in the state, at the state level, governors and state legislatures, they have to understand this. And I think our national leadership must understand this, and it must be reflected in all of our public policies.
I want to thank Dr. Wilson, Dr. Sands, and Dr. Bumpus for jumpstarting a wonderful conversation and getting us to think about all of these critically important issues. So thank you all, and we will now transition to panel number 2. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So our second panel is the remaining unanswered big diversity questions, and we have a wonderful group of panelists to join us. I'm going to introduce them now. Dr. Lisa M. Coleman, Senior Vice President for Global Inclusion and Strategic Innovation at New York University. Dr. Ken D. Coopwood, who's the co-founder of Cooplu. Dr. William T. Lewis, who's also a co-founder of Cooplu. And Dr. Deborah Joy Perez, who's the Senior Vice President for Organizational Culture, Inclusion, and Equity at Simmons University. So welcome.
Thank you.
And thank you all
Happy
for
to be
being
here.
here. So I want to just start off with getting your reaction. We heard a lot from the presidents and thought leaders, and I just was curious, as a starting point, what did you make of some of what you heard? So we'll start with Dr. Cooper.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for having me, Dr. Watson. I really enjoyed listening to the presidents, President Sands and Bumpus and Wilson. And one takeaway I would say right off the top that really, really made some sense to me is Dr. Bumpus spoke about redefining what student support services is. And the fact that the population continues to become more and more diverse also means so does the services that are necessary to sustain these students and bring them to, as you coined it, to the finish line. So doing that in terms of student services means, in my mind, reconstructing the whole gamut of what higher education means. And as Dr. Sands says, that starts at the state level, down to the board level, to institutional leadership, and to the executors in terms of vice presidents, and in particular, the chief diversity officers or executive officers, or chief strategists, as some of them call them as well.
Dr. Coleman?
Yes, I agree. I think that what I heard and what I appreciate is also the emphasis on strategic planning. We know that's really crucial for universities, and it's something that many undertake, not just at the university level, but also at the school level or the departmental level. And so to make sure that those strategic plans, as all of the presidents say, have baked, right, diversity, inclusion, and equity into those plans. And I think also, and I think this was Dr. Wilson or Dr. Bumpus who said this, is that we know that what is in those plans and then how are we measuring it and how is it tied, and I know some people already brought this up in the Q&A, and how is it tied to the finances, and how are we going to make sure that we're upholding, right, diversity and inclusion in these times when sometimes budgets are going to be cut. And I'd just like to say here, I also think that, I think it was Dr. Wilson who said this, and diversity and inclusion, COVID-19 is a diversity and inclusion issue. It is about food insecurity. It is about broadband. It is about access. It is about health and safety in our homes. So many who had to return to homes that were unsafe. It is about health and the disparities of health. So COVID-19 has not just uncovered, it has, right, demonstrated again where we are in this country in terms of diversity and inclusion issues. And that's very pertinent to our higher education institutions.
Well said. Dr. Lewis.
Yes, I want to say thank you, first of all, Dr. Jamal, for having us on this call. I would say one of the things that I noticed was that I think it was Dr. Bumpus that talks about that COVID-19 has magnified, right? And so going back to Dr. Coleman's thoughts, is magnified the issues. And I would also add that it is accelerating our thinking. And so these are a lot of the stuff that we're talking about now, we've been thinking about, our college presidents have been thinking about. However, COVID-19 is accelerating that thinking and is pushing that action faster than what we perhaps would have done in the past. And so for me, what resonated in that previous conversation is that this has illuminated for many what the problems have been, and now it's accelerating the action towards resolving the challenges of diversity, equity, and inclusion.
Yeah. I want to go to Dr. Perez, who's just with us by audio today. Dr. Perez.
Yes, thank you so much, Dr. Watson. I guess I'll stick with the theme of adding yet another adjective. I want to echo some of the comments of my co-panelists to say that these disparities and inequities have been around forever and we've known about them. So they're not, you know, I wouldn't say that COVID uncovered them. I would say that COVID has exacerbated them. And so everything that was experienced in terms of inequities in social determinants of health, in access to education, in equitable, in inclusive classrooms has now been worsened as a result of COVID. What I appreciated about the comments on the president's panel is Dr. Wilson's point about demonstrating care about the students as people, and you know, really checking in with them to see how they're doing, and you know, beyond the expectations as students, but what is their life like, their day to day. I think Dr. Coleman is spot on in terms of recognizing that some of our students at our universities are safer at the university than they are in their own homes. And so not all students have safe homes to go to, especially if they're dealing with issues of identity, LGBT, et cetera, and all the other income insecurity issues. I also agree with Dr. Sand's point about, you know, this work of diversity, equity, inclusion is not a sideline or a side gig. It is the work, integrating it into everything you do. And I want to say, and I'll say more about this later when we do the Q&A, that if equity, explicit equity isn't part of your recovery plan, your reopening plan, you need to rethink your reopening plan and your recovery plan. It has to be part and parcel of every conversation. How are we going to ensure equity as we bring people back? And I'll say more specifically about that. And then finally, Dr. Bumpus's point on, you know, emphasizing the past damage done by inequity and aspirations. And it's hard to really focus on that given that we have inequities in all other ways, but this idea is what do we expect when we give we invest so little in the most vulnerable among us. I do agree with some of the Q&A that I saw go by live around, we really need to talk about specific actions that anyone can take to leverage equity and excellence in terms of the work, regardless of whether your institution has an explicit focus on DEI or not. So I'm looking forward to this conversation. I have more thoughts to share later.
We definitely want to move into some practical solutions, obviously, and some outcomes that we might give to the audience, and things that we can certainly do to implement some of these ideas. But to your point, Dr. Perez, and I know that it was amplified by Dr. Wilson as well in terms of checking in with students. And I was wondering if you all thought there should be a more kind of organized or structured way to do that, particularly as it relates to underrepresented minority students. Should institutions think about surveying students during this time to get a sense of really what they're experiencing and then how to respond to those needs?
Absolutely. I think hearing from not just students, but staff and faculty here at Simmons, we issued a pulse survey that we partnered with Gallup on to hear about how our employees, just not forget that our employees and our staff at all levels are also dealing with COVID and their families and also dealing with remote work. So we did a pulse survey on how our employees were managing through times of intense change and disruption. And we knew that many of our employees were experiencing challenges since COVID outbreak starting in March. So we've implemented some changes as a result. Just give you one at our university, which we created kind of a 2-hour gap in the middle of the day where we essentially said to all of our leaders and managers, you can't host meetings between 12 and 2. We need to give folks who are home with children or caretaking, we have to give them a break in the middle of the day where they're not worried about a work call. We ensure that our employees remain healthy while delivering on our mission to support our students, and that the results of this survey, we're still doing the analysis now, but we will tell us what the attitudes, knowledge, and beliefs are of our community as they are dealing with COVID. I'll just give you a couple of examples of some of the questions we asked is, how well prepared do you feel to do your job remotely? How well informed do you feel about what's going on in your organization? Are you able to maintain a healthy balance between work and personal commitments? So my answer to that question is a resounding yes, Dr. Watson.
Yeah, Dr. Cooper?
Yes, absolutely. I think tying the president's conversation to that question as well, Dr. Bumper said something that resonated to me deeply, that you can't start from scratch with engagement. And that is a powerful revelation, unfortunately, for too many institutions now that are finding themselves scrambling to connect to certain populations in during the COVID epidemic and beyond. And if you weren't connected to these students before COVID came on the scene, it's all the more difficult to connect to them now. And we really have to take to heart the exponential impact it is to connect to students who weren't connected in the first place. And now that we have to do that, the spell some dismal concerns and circumstances for a lot of institutions, including the inevitable drop in enrollment, the inevitable choice to to simply stay at home and drop out, stop out, etc. And these things make it, as we've all said, they make it all the more exponentially difficult to just deal with the basic stuff: food, clothing, housing, etc. We have to start from scratch in many cases with just getting the student and the faculty, staff, administrators to some extent to actually value their connection with an institution. Yeah. And that is something that needs to be really part of an ongoing strategic plan, is keeping people connected from the day that they become officially enrolled.
Yeah, no, good point. Dr. Coleman.
Yes, well, I think surveys are important. I want to underscore what my former panelists have said as well. But I also think there's a lot of data out there. And sometimes at institutions, we want to over-survey and resurvey. And that's not to say that surveys now aren't important to get to some of the salient issues. But I also think we know what some of the issues have been. And as has been already said, they have been accelerated. So I think it also depends on how much resources you have right now, right, to actually do surveys and how comprehensive those could be when perhaps you can allocate resources to other areas. So I think we can pull from local and national data as well that demonstrates, right, patterns in and trends in your areas. I also think that there are other ways to collect data. We've been doing town halls and listening sessions, right, and this goes back to Dr. Wilson's point to also demonstrate that we care, but also, right, that we can get what some people might see as anecdotal information, but it allows us to actually engage with our community members. And then the other piece, of course, is I think it's important to survey students, but I also think it's important right now to survey faculty. I don't know about anybody else's faculty, but we just did a survey on the average age of our faculty. And so we know what the trends are through the American Council on Education, et cetera. But let's just say it's a plus 60 group. And so their abilities to navigate technology in the new ways with students and all of those things and the impact, right, and the resources that they need, and also the differential impact on our faculty of color, our faculty of members of LGBTQ+ populations and disability, right? So in that way, also, I think it's important that as we're conducting these surveys to figure out what resources are needed across the board.
Yeah. Can I just add one thing to that, Dr.
Yeah.
Watson? That is, yes. It makes no sense to survey if you're not going to use the data. And I would agree, you don't want to mislead folks by asking them questions that we're not prepared to respond to.
And let me just piggyback on that, Deborah, and that's where it goes back to the strategic plans, right? Marrying that data and baking it into the strategic plan so you can actually then say, this is where we are, this is the goal, and then you can have an outcome, and that's the action, so then you can report out. Because the other piece right now is communication is key to our constituents and ensuring that we are providing accurate information about what it is we're doing and what actions we're taking in the immediate term, right, medium term, and then long term.
Absolutely.
Dr. Lewis?
Yes, I would say absolutely. I agree with my colleagues in terms of surveying the students and the faculty. Kupla, we have surveyed our colleagues in arms who are actually doing the work. And so in the work of diversity, so a lot of times we miss out on really showing that we care to our colleagues who are in the trenches. And so working in partnership with the Samuel DeWitt Proctor Institute for Diversity and Social Justice at Rutgers University, we have launched a survey of about 100 chief diversity officers and diversity professionals for them to tell us how they are experiencing this work. Because when you're talking about re-emerging and when you're talking about helping faculty, students, and staff, we got to also look at the caregiver, the folks who are responsible for helping the faculty, the students, and staff. And so we're also looking at interviewing and surveying that population as well. So surveying is very key. Getting that data is very key. And then also doing something with that data is just as important.
Now that's a nice segue actually into the question, and it comes from Kevin Christian, who says, as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic, how do you view and envision the role and significance of the Chief Diversity Officer at our institutions? Dr. Coleman, you want to take that first?
Who is it?
All right.
Dr. Coleman.
Me or Dr.
I'll start with you, Dr. Coleman.
That's me, sorry.
Yes.
I hear you. Sorry, just making sure. I just think this is the time, right? When I look at that question, this is the most significant role in many, many ways. I mean, I think someone talked about student success, right? But I see student success as married to diversity and inclusion. And if those offices aren't married together, I mean, I think that's something to rethink, of course, in your strategic plan. But it is one of the most significant roles. And we think about the populations, right? Students of color, students with disabilities, women who are disproportionately impacted. We've been looking at the numbers of women who are not publishing during this era because, of course, the impact on women is greater in terms of caretaking at home, right? populations, members of the disability populations, our undocumented, our Latinx populations, our aged populations, and then people coming in at the other end, our Generation Z and Alphas. We are the institution. And so in that way, we are the most significant in terms of guiding us through this. And actually, I also think we're the most significant because many of us, right, to go back to something that Dr. Bumpus and Dr. Wilson said, many of us have always been aware of these issues. And so we were prepared for the acceleration in our offices and with our partners. So we have been looking at these trends for a long time. And it's a good idea, right? Not only to involve us. I mean, I don't know what other, people are developing senior committees, et cetera, but to make sure that your diversity and inclusion officer is on that senior committee, is talking to your board, like Dr. Sands said, in terms of the right influences with the board, particularly if it's boards of regents, et cetera. So again, I can't underscore it enough.
Anyone else want to weigh in on this issue about the? Go ahead, Dr. Lewis.
Yes, I would say that absolutely. And again, this role is very important. Those who are on the front lines in the diversity and inclusion space, those who are on the front lines of student affairs, very important for you to begin to take care of yourself. And then also, not only do you take care of yourself in this moment, because we have a pause. We're in a place where our creator or deity, whatever you want to call it, has given us a pause. So within this moment of pause, I would say it's time for us to begin to think about how we as professionals reemerge. So we've been thinking about how the college and the university reemerges. We've been thinking about how the students reemerge and how the faculty reemerge. But we also have to talk about how we as individuals reemerge into post-COVID in terms of how we're going to show up and how we're going to be taken seriously and the relevancy of our work in this moment. This is a moment where we can seize the opportunity to really, really show that D&I professionals and those who work in this space are needed on the front lines and cannot be misunderstood or misundertaken.
And that's one of the things that we're hearing over and over again, that there are these opportunities that exist.
Right. Right.
To emerge from this, not the same way that we were before. Sorry, Dr. Pullman.
Can I just
sorry.
The opportunities that are presented, and if we look at what's happening with funding agencies, I know this came up earlier with NIH, NSF, even other kinds of funding organizations, there are opportunities right now in this era for diversity and inclusion officers to actually take the lead in terms of getting these funds, whether it's partnering with technology companies, we're looking at what Google's doing, Facebook, et cetera. So I really think also, as Dr. Lewis was saying, the opportunities, there's such a plethora of opportunities. And if you're not working with your diversity and inclusion officer, you might miss some of those opportunities, particularly in the funding realm.
Yeah,
Dr. Perez, and then we'll go to you,
yes.
Dr. Kubler. Good.
Yeah, I know this is there's a lot of conversation to be had. And I just want to contextualize what I'm about to say with the fact that I've only been in academia for 2 years. I spent 20 years working in professional philanthropy in 3 foundations, the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation, the Annie E. Casey Foundation, and the Gordon Betty Moore Foundation. And I've also served on the Broadening Participation Committee in Education Human Resources at National Science Foundation. My background is actually in public health and specifically worked on issues of racial and ethnic disparities. So what I'm about to say just has a bit of a framework for this discussion, which is that, first and foremost, I think, we've been talking about DEI and not defining DEI. So anyone on the call, the first thing you need to do is go back to your definitions and see, who it is that you define as diverse or underrepresented. How are you defining the equitable conditions for their success, whether it has to do with safety, health, ability to succeed, et cetera, and what it means to undo the structures that have kept many populations entrenched in oppression and in systems of privilege. And then what does inclusion mean? Like the actual active intentional engagement with these populations that we're talking about. So it is the time, it is the day, it is now that we must keep DEI work top of mind. This is a huge opportunity for, as was mentioned, for funding, not just in the science of COVID, but in the social determinants of COVID and the outcome. it's easy for folks to say and to ignore that these disparities have or have always existed, and there's not much we can do. But there is a lot that we can do. The truth about the pandemic is it's magnified these economic and fragility, these physical safety issues. And every day we're reminded about the structural and institutional racism and privilege that work in this country. Just to think about what we heard this week. In the same week, you see white civilians openly carrying firearms in the State House and not suffering a single consequence, not even detention or charges. And that same week, we see images of Mr. Ahmaud Arbery, a black jogger in Georgia who was chased down and gunned down by white men, not police. So COVID has elevated and escalated these health inequities, but they've also continue beyond COVID. We continue to live in a world where there are these racial ethnic disparities in general treatment. So I'm all for more specifically, what can institutions do to remedy this is if you have a strong institution with a strong mission like NYU or Simmons or any one of the universities, Morgan, that we heard from, you're probably better positioned. But even if you don't, if you come from an institution that has not prioritized DEI, how do you go about making it important? And all you have to do is look at all of what's being done to ensure new procedures and protocols, see how they're disparately impacting the different populations you care most about. Bring that data to those in leadership, and then ask to be a part of the solution.
Well said, Dr. Kublik.
Yes, well, Dr. Watson, you opened our can when you asked this question, and everybody's talking fast and hearty to get their piece in.
It's an important question.
It's an important question. In fact, it's a transformational question. And I like to start again with something Dr. Wilson said. He said if diversity and inclusion are not preserved, then the profession, the very concept of it, will be damaged going forward after COVID. We must preserve the front line is your institutional chief diversity officer or chief strategist officer, especially now. And that why, especially now, is because we know historically American higher education doesn't change quickly. And it has historical components that say the sooner we can get back to status quo, the sooner we're more comfortable. But now we need to be at the table, which at too many institutions you don't see a diversity professional. They're in the trenches somewhere. But we need to be at the table now, as Dr. Perez says, where strategy is being practiced and where behaviors are being changed and patterns or paradigms for what true diversity and inclusion administration looks like is on the forefront. And as we do these things, what we begin to do is build new allies, and we need to begin to restructure the political capital from the state level to the board level with presidents and horizontally with the other vice presidents and senior administrators that serves to better keep the core work of diversity inclusion not just up front, but to keep it very relevant. And that is, the relevancy has to be about executing systemic transformation for the commonwealth of all the institutional constituents. But for purpose of this conversation, it's specifically about maintaining whatever progress was present post-COVID, pre-COVID to post-COVID. And you can't do that nowhere near effectively if you don't have somebody at the table who understands how people need to be served.
Yeah.
And that's why that question is such a hot button, because too often higher education makes decisions without information about those whom the decision will impact.
Yeah, and it's a critical question, of course, a question that our publication, Diverse Issues in Higher Education, has to ask, because it's at the center of everything that we do in the history and legacy of our organization. There's a question here about international students, and oftentimes we have not really focused too much on international students who are sort of caught in between, right? Many who cannot return home, but also who feel that that they're suffering from a lot of fiscal or financial problems, but of course can't be supported because with some of the federal funds that have been filtered down. So can you all talk about international students and what institutions might be doing to support them during this time?
Well, let me jump in.
Okay.
No, go
Dr. Coleman, I think he's giving you the floor.
Yeah, go ahead.
Well, just to provide some context about NYU, we have a campus in Shanghai, a campus in Abu Dhabi. We have 13 campuses globally, and those include places like Paris, London, etc. We have research sites in places like Dublin and all across the world. In fact, we are one of the most international schools in the country. And part of that is because we have the portal campuses where you can apply to go to school to NYU and go to a school in Shanghai, start in Shanghai or Abu Dhabi and spend your 4 years there. I say that to say because when we look, we've had to spend a lot of time thinking about what this is going to mean in the international sphere. And I'm also on the board of my undergraduate college, which is a small liberal arts college. So I'm going to speak from both of those perspectives. First, what we've done is really then look at what our international presence is, right? So in both cases, looking at alums and looking at where we had international presence so we can create what we're calling hubs in those locations. And that's to allow for our students, in case they're not going to be able to return, to actually then have people in those locations that they can communicate with in a more ongoing way, particularly if you think about the differences in time, etc. Even as we try to plan meetings at NYU, sometimes people are 12 hours ahead or 8 hours behind. And so really trying to take those things into consideration, because of course, as people are unable to leave their homes and differences in technologies, we've also had to think about that with our international students. The other piece that we've done and one of the other institutions that I work with is also doing homestays. A lot of international students were not able to return home for whatever reasons during this time. And so instead of, in some places, people created dorms where international students were going to stay. And depending on what resources you had available. One of the institutions with whom I work, as I've just said, has done homestays to allow international students because they wanted to move people out of the residence hall so they wouldn't be living in isolation in the same kinds of ways and in isolation and maybe infecting delivery workers and things like that. So to really get them into locales where they could have some limited interactions. But I really think that when we're thinking about international students, and lastly, what I'll say here is obviously working with your local state officials to figure out exactly what that's going to mean in the future. We know that there will be limitations in terms of visas, in terms of how those will be granted moving forward. And I also think this is the time really, and this is the last thing I'll say, is to really think about how we're engaging our global communities in different ways, right? And not just depending on, we've been looking at the impact on the environment. And we know that coming out of this, not just because of finance, people are just probably not going to travel as much. So how do we engage those global communities using technologies and using some of the tools, right? And we're developing a very high level digital inclusion toolkit, which has a very special focus on internationalism out of our office.
Dr. Cooper?
Okay, thank you. I just had a few additional comments because Dr. Coleman's response was very comprehensive. But, when I think about, from my experience with international students and populations, one of the first things that happen when there's crisis or something unfavorable is how to get those students off campus. But the truth is many students don't want to leave campus even if they could. And they, the truth is we find many students are being disconnected from the institution as if they're guests as opposed to residents of the institution. There's lots of international students who are legal permanent residencies of the United States. And people tend to ignore or walk over those factors when something like COVID comes along that causes people to divide one set of the population from another. It's important, as we've been talking about, in terms of equity and inclusion and equality, to have a strategic plan and systems that allow international students to function on campus just as if they lived across the street. And understand that just like domestic students can't go home, the same would be true for international students. And it's a systemic issue when we have to isolate any student population in terms of what services can or cannot be provided for them. So Dr. Coleman, I appreciate your response, but a lot's being done. It sounds like on your end, and we have to get away from segmenting the student population to the extent that we're saying we don't know what to do with this group or that group, in terms of the general services that every institution should provide.
Yeah. But I'm also wondering about also the issue of recruitment of international students at our institutions. Is that also, I mean, I imagine that that's also a challenge that we've reported on that issue as well. I was wondering if anyone had any thoughts about that.
Well, we are not seeing the downturn that we thought we would see in terms of, but many of the applications, of course, came in pre-COVID-19, right? And so we know that. The question is whether people will be able to come. And some of that is just around the impact. I think for us, I'll speak from New York City, of course, we're also concerned about how people are perceiving New York City. And so that is dependent upon, I think, also your locale, because of the kinds of news, et cetera, about how, the concentration and things like that. So we also have had to send out some additional messages and communications about things that we're doing here. But you're exactly right, Jamal. Of course, there's an impact on recruitment. And I'm glad you actually said that, because the other piece that I think is crucial, and Dr. Cooper reminded me of this, are parents. And so as you're recruiting international students, right, parents become even more crucial in many, many ways. So how are you making sure that you're engaging those parents, not just the students internationally? And so that's, again, why I brought up homestays and things like that, because we want to make sure we're engaging the communities and not just, right, the individual student, because that helps with recruitment. It helps sustain, right, connection to the university, and then helps them think about themselves in a community where they will want to rejoin at the time when they're able to do so. I also see some questions about DACA here, and so I'll let someone else talk about that, but I will say that we have put in some very pre-COVID-19 and post around supporting our DACA students, but I'll let someone else answer that question.
Dr. Perez, did you want to jump in?
Yeah, I'll just say that it is true that the CARES Act excluded DACA students. And what we've done at Simmons is to combine some resources and make them available through our own fundraising. Many universities have established student funds for emergencies that support, and particularly international students and DACA students. I think we'll see more of that to come. But some universities are having, of course, given the federal ban on using resources, are investing their own monies.
Yeah, no, that's important.
I did, Dr. Watson, just some specific examples of, what folks can do now in terms of in leveraging and emphasizing equity and excellence as part of their recovery and reopening plans. So all of us are in this process now where we're designing protocols that need to be in place to keep the community safe. And so the question to ask is, how is equity being accounted for in things like social distancing, respect of the workforce at all levels, but particularly for cleaning and dining staff and facilities? How do we keep them safe and ensure they're treated respectfully? And what do we do about returning students from vulnerable groups, just as those, for example, with mental health concerns? You can imagine social distancing having a even more difficult and extreme impact on those with mental health concerns. So, we have been looking at, how do we develop these protocols and procedures and look at each one, whether it's PPE or social distancing through an equity lens, and to find a place to really have the conversation around communicating confidence. I think to the point about, Boston is also a hot spot. It's also marketplace of some 53 colleges and universities. So recognizing that there's fear in returning and how to communicate transparently, as well as listen to what people are saying. And then, you know, what is the kind of culture that we want to create in returning? For example, we want what we're doing in terms of a reopening policy and a recovery strategy to connect to our vision. And our vision at Simmons is to be the most inclusive campus in New England. So as we implement protocols and policies, we need to find ways to connect back to that vision. This is why we're doing what we're doing, and remembering the why. And that includes things like treating each other with extra kindness, you know, and respect, honoring our policies and protocols and procedures around, you know, behavior and expectations, prioritizing kindness and empathy, being mindful of inequities and privilege during and before and after the pandemic, and to create this kind of culture of continuous learning and professional development. So we are on the top of our game as we're providing the support. You know, I think that one thing is clear during this crisis, both as we experience the move out and we're planning for the move in, is that people will remember, you know, not what you did or what they say, but as Maya Angelou always says, they remember how you made them feel. And how people feel when they return is going to matter in terms of how successful we are in making the return as equitable and as safe as possible.
We've heard today that there are a number of hiring freezes. We know that that's the reality in case around the country, but I also want us to think about the possibilities. We talked about this on the last webinar that we did about the importance of establishing relationships and building a pipeline and keeping in touch with folk now, even if you're not necessarily hiring, so that they're on your radar screen. That's really important. And also, I'm hopeful that after we emerge from this, that we can be more creative in how we think about advertising, right, for positions, how we think about recruiting for positions, so that we're not just going to the same old outlets that we've always done. I keep telling people diverse issues at higher education is open, and you can advertise with us, because that's really important, because we have to think differently about how we attract diverse and particularly underrepresented candidates. And I just wanted you all to weigh in on that as well.
Hey, Doc. Hey, Jamal. This is William. One of the things, I was just on a call yesterday with some diversity officers and professionals in New England, and we were talking about this whole notion around hiring. And one of the challenges, it's not even a challenge, but the opportunity. I see everything as an opportunity. So the opportunity right now is for our diversity professionals, our chief diversity officers, to begin to develop a relationship. If you don't have it right now, develop a relationship right now with your department chairs, right? And so, because that's where hiring is going to happen. It's not going to happen at the central administration, especially when we're talking about faculty. It happens within the context of that faculty space, and it's really, and hiring is really nuanced to the department needs, right? And so a university may say, we want to hire 50 faculty over the next hiring cycle. However, it comes down to the department in terms of what they need in terms of their qualifications. So as a diversity officer or diversity professional, my recommendation is to begin to talk to those department chairs. What right now, what are you thinking about hiring? And also begin to question them about their whole notion of excellence. What does excellent look like? Begin to question them about this whole notion of scholarship and what's relevant and what's acceptable. And so begin to help them to reframe their thinking around excellence. And so when it comes time to hiring someone, when they're at their annual conference and they see someone that may not, in a year ago, may not fit their perspective, your conversation with them helps them to reimagine what excellence looks like. And now they're going to bring that person to the table. So I think hiring is about developing relationships, but it's really about developing relationships with department chairs, having and helping them to build their capacity around equity mindedness.
I just want to add to Dr. Lewis's point around how to be explicit around hiring for equity, and that, you know, you can't have a more diverse workforce of faculty or staff if you're not intentional and have some programming in place to recognize the added value. And I think, you know, one of the things that we've done at Simmons, and we're about to work on our first African-American president in our 100+ year history in July, is that we have prioritized, you know, equity as on all of our searches, not just the top search, but across the board. And we have a committee that's called Thrive, which is a loose acronym that really stands for transforming our hiring and recruitment processes. I want to make the point, because it was made online here, you know, using words like social distancing versus physical distancing, I'm absolutely in agreement. That's another opportunity to change the narrative, right? It's to be the person in the room to say, let's distinguish what it means to be socially isolated versus physically isolated. But on this, back to this hiring point, I just, again, if you're not intentional in partnership with your HR department, how we did it at Simmons, this is not going to get done. And there are lots of research opportunities. This is a time to have a more diverse faculty doing research, because I can promise you, just as when I spent time in philanthropy, in 2005, I was with Robert Wood Johnson Foundation when Katrina happened, and we invested, like many other foundations, millions and millions of dollars in New Orleans. And there was so much opportunity and so few scholars and researchers of color who were given the opportunity. You know, so I think now is the time to build on that research community of color and other underrepresented groups to play a part in the post-COVID research world.
Yeah, no, well said. And we are actually out of time. It is 2:30, and 45 minutes goes by really quickly.
It does.
But I thank you all for taking time and helping us to dissect these issues. You are a brilliant panel. So thank you, Dr. Perez. Thank you, Dr. Coopwood, Dr. Coleman, and Dr. Lewis. Thank you all for your engagement today and keeping this conversation moving. I'm going to turn this over to Sinead Reese. Thank you.
Thanks so much for joining us today. Please make sure to join us on May 27th for our next webcast, College Athletics After COVID-19. What is the impact? What are the ramifications? You can view past Diverse.Talk live webcasts on our website. And to stay abreast of the latest diversity and inclusion news in higher education, sign up for our newsletters and subscribe to our magazine, including the DigiMag at diverseeducation.com. Thanks again.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.